Shute here. I'm sorry I haven't posted anything recently, but things have been actually quite busy, in a good way, so I can't complain. But there are definitely some videos that I'm meaning to do in the near future. I've had requests for the Chrysler Preludium and Allegro, the Franck Sonata, and there are many others that I would like to do as well. Mendelssohn Concerto, Tchaikovsky Concerto, a number of others. So I will get to those as soon as time permits. But for now, I actually have a student who's just starting the third Mozart violin concerto, the first movement. And in light of the COVID-19 shutdown, I thought probably the best place to start would be with a video like this. So I thought I'd also make it public for anyone else who might enjoy seeing it. So to start, my feeling about Mozart concertos is that we violinists often study them a little bit earlier than is good for us. And I'm not talking about age, but more kind of where we are in our musical and technical development. Mozart concertos don't look difficult on paper, but Mozart requires such finesse of articulation and such vivid sound and characterization that the concertos are, in fact, quite difficult. Oftentimes, I feel like, especially this third Mozart concerto is taught as an introductory piece to the classical style. For me, personally, I would sooner make an introductory classical concerto, something like the Haydn G major concerto. Bowing-wise, I feel it's a little more accessible. It's not that it's lesser music, it's just that it's a different manifestation of the classical style. Mozart is a bit more operatic, and as a result, I think, just more difficult in terms of what he demands of the instrument and the player. So my feeling is that it's better to wait on Mozart until a student is a little bit more developed technically and musically, and then dive in with those. But when it comes to studying Mozart concertos, I think one thing that's very important is that we have a good edition to work from. Because you'll find if you look at an Urtext edition, right, an Urtext just kind of means the original text. It's a bit of a problematic term because sometimes we can't really know what the composer's intentions were, or if those intentions changed. What if Mozart wrote one thing in his manuscript, but then a first edition that Mozart approved of came out and it was different. So that can be a little bit problematic, but with an Urtext edition, at least we have an edition that comes as close as possible, as close as we can do to what Mozart would have intended to the best of our judgment. But if you look at an Urtext edition of these Mozart concertos, and you compare it to a non-Urtext edition, something like this is a common one, you'll find actually many significant differences, and we'll get into those a little bit later. But for now, I just want to start by saying, make sure that when you're learning Mozart concertos, or just repertoire of this period in general, that you have a nice Urtext edition to work from. I usually recommend this one, Baronreiter. Some other Urtext editions have very good scholarship that goes into the piano score, but then the violin parts are edited with fingerings and bowings that actually aren't very historical. Whereas Baronreiter usually comes with an Urtext, an unedited violin part, and then we'll sometimes have another violin part that has been edited. And sometimes those can be more or less historical, but they do come with that unedited violin part that can be very helpful to work from. But even if we have a good edition, the question is, of course, how do we read it? Because the things that you'll find in an Urtext edition don't by any means necessarily speak for themselves. I mean, something like this. What does Mozart mean by, these grace note figures, and why are they different lengths sometimes? So questions like that can arise. So we have to know how to interpret an Urtext edition. At this point, I should actually mention my friend Emily Deans, who's just created a scholarly performance edition of the third Mozart concerto, which I haven't seen yet. I don't think it's quite out, but I needed to make this video for my student who's learning this. But I am very much looking forward to seeing that, so that's something to have on everyone's radar. In fact, Emily, if you're seeing this, I don't know if you have plans to have it published, but if you do, and there's some way that we can all benefit from your research, feel free to indicate something in the comments below. I know that would be very helpful to all of us. So, but moving forward, without the benefit at the moment of Emily's research, let's just have a look at some general considerations that can inform how we approach Mozart's concertos in general, and specifically the third concerto. So, I've touched on this sort of thing before, but the instrument that Mozart would have been using is a little bit different than what we've got today. Something a little bit more in this form, where you have the neck at aligned, it's parallel with the body of the instrument, not angled downward as on a modern violin, where if I hold this flat, the neck actually goes downward. And when you have an instrument with a flat neck, or a neck that is parallel to the body, what that means is there's less downward tension on the bridge. So this instrument is under much less tension. It's got strings of plain gut, usually sheep or ox gut, that are, in Mozart's time, would have been tuned a little bit lower than what we have today. I think tuning that Mozart was using at some point was 422. We tuned to 440. Not quite a half step below what we're using, and I'm not sure if that's what Mozart would have been playing for these concertos. Maybe Emily or someone else will know that better than I do. But in any case, probably a little bit lower than what we tune to today. So the sound would have been more mellow. The other thing with gut strings is the response is more mellow as well, and they're less brilliant, especially up high. Right? We have on the modern violin these metal E strings that we can go all the way up the fingerboard, and they're very clear and loud. Gut strings, not so much. So when Mozart goes further and further up the fingerboard, he'll go up to G or A. Sometimes at one point in the Sinfonia Concertante, toward the end of his much too short life, he goes up to an E flat, and that's way up in the stratosphere. But my point is that whenever in a Mozart concerto we start going up above, say, an octave above the highest string, up to the E, F, G, A area, I think we can really feel like that's the super top of the treble register. We don't want to feel like it's somewhere in the middle of the violin, right? If we're used to playing Sibelius or a lot of more modern repertoire, I don't know why the violin concerto of Thomas Adis that I saw recently comes to mind. The violin so often is way up here. That's not going to be the norm in Mozart's time. So as soon as we start getting up to about here, we really need to feel like we're getting to the top of where these strings can sound really good. And so there's that extra soloistic brilliance to it, and I think we can be really conscious of that. It also means that we're generally going to favor low positions. If you go all the way up the D string, I don't know if you can see well on the camera, but the D string is really quite thick. The thicknesses that they would have used in Mozart's time are even thicker than I think a lot of us tend to use today even on period instruments. So quite a thick string, and especially with the D, the higher you go, it just sounds a little bit more mellow. So the lower positions give you a bit more open and easy resonance. So those are the kinds of fingerings that would have been favored in Mozart's time. The flip side to that, though, is if we're using a modern instrument, maybe a low position on the E string is going to sound a little bit more metallic, a little bit more bright and metallic than would be the case on a more mellow gut string. So maybe then we want to play that on a modern instrument in third or a slightly higher position on the A string. That's a consideration. Something else about these instruments, they don't have a chin rest. Never mind a shoulder rest on the bottom. The shoulder rest wasn't developed, I think, until the early into the second decade of the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken. But they wouldn't have had a chin rest for quite a while. In fact, even Paganini's Caprices would have been written and played without a chin rest in view. So what that means is that we balance the instrument on the collarbone, or Mozart would have balanced the instrument on the collarbone. Upward shifts are fairly straightforward. Downward shifts become a little bit more problematic. Either you can put a little bit of friction with the chin, but a lot of people, especially before Mozart's time, would have played with the chin entirely off, which would mean that downward shifts would have to be walked down from the left hand. What that usually means is that abrupt shifts, especially abrupt downward shifts, are not so common. That can also affect our fingering choices, and that in turn affects what sort of color we're getting from the strings, what position we're in and on what string. So that's something we can keep in view as well. Now, when we talk about the bow, that's where things really get interesting. Because Germany, at this point, was quite a hodgepodge. There were many variants of what we'll call the Baroque bow, but in general, they all were convex in shape and came toward, so that you had a lot of weight at the frog and much less weight at the tip. In fact, this bow has more weight than some would have had. This is a kind of later Baroque English model that closely resembles the German. But this sort of a bow would have been used in Germany until the early 1800s. Meanwhile, bows that looked like this were coming into use. This one is from 1760 or so. And you can see that this, and there were many designs of these so-called classical or transitional bows, which may be a misnomer because it suggests that they were on their way to something better, whereas really what they, the kind of music and the kinds of articulations that they do well, they do very well, and they're fine bows in their own right. So transitional, I feel, is kind of a misnomer. But this bow, you'll see, has a little bit of that outward curve like a Baroque bow. And then as you get toward the tip, just a little bit of inward curve to sustain that sound to a heavier tip. And that's being used from really quite early on in the second half of the 18th century. So really, basically, from the time Mozart is born, soon after, people are starting to use bows more like that. And then this is the fully modern bow, which starts to become adopted around the 1790s. And of course, we're much more familiar generally with this design, concave all the way through, a much more even camber, going to a heavy tip. And the whole purpose of this bow is just to sustain more or less evenly from frog to tip. So the bow that Mozart would have been raised with is this Baroque bow. So his father, Leopold Mozart, published a treatise on violin playing and illustrating bow holes on exactly this kind of bow. So we know that that's what his father played, and it's what young Mozart would have learned on from his father. So we can imagine that the bow strokes required by this bow would have been quite ingrained in Wolfgang's mind. So what are the properties of this bow? Well, I mentioned that we have a lot of weight down at the frog and not a lot of weight at the tip. That means that there's a certain inequality built into the bow stroke. It naturally catches at the frog and releases toward the tip. It also means that the strokes are slightly unequal. The down bows are going to be slightly heavier than the up bows because we just naturally have more weight going this direction than we do going in this direction. And as a result of that, they developed what was called the rule of the down bow, which is basically that down beats or strong beats, strong notes, strong impulses should correspond to the down bow and not the other way round, which changes very much when we get to the modern bow, but we'll get there. When we look at this classical bow, which we have reason to think Mozart might have been exposed to early on, I don't believe that we know what bow he played on when he played these concertos. He wrote them when he was 19, Concertmeister in Salzburg, so presumably for himself to play. But I'm not sure we know what kind of bow he was playing, but I think it's reasonable to assume that he would have been exposed to this kind of bow and to music that was being written to exploit what this kind of bow can do. And I think there's evidence. I think his concertos show evidence of a style that at least would make good use of this kind of bow. So what we have with this is we still have that outward bend that gives us a Baroque type articulation. So it's still articulate, but we just have that little bit of extra sustain at the tip. It also means that we can violate that rule of the down bow just a little bit. Sometimes we can have this sort of a stroke, where the strong 16 notes for a little while start going the other direction. Mozart will sometimes have us do that. And I think that can be some indication of taste changing as bow making changed. But here's the important thing. Whenever we violate the rule of the down bow, I think we need to feel like we're violating the rule of the down bow. Right? We should still be governed by that down bow principle, but whenever we break from it, we should really feel like, aha, I'm breaking out of the mold. And oftentimes there's an element of show or playfulness to it. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind. What's important to know as regards the modern bow is actually largely a matter of negatives, what we probably wouldn't do. So we wouldn't probably have hooked bowings of this sort. That belongs much more to what the modern bow does. Détaché in the upper half. That's, again, a much more modern bow sort of stroke. Or have many times when bowings are reversed so that strong impulses fall in the upper half of the bow. Again, that's a modern stroke because actually on the modern bow the sound is quite warm right in here. I know, for example, the Philadelphia Orchestra has a principle that whenever possible, they're going to play in this part of the bow, because on the modern bow, it's a very mellow-sounding, nice, warm part of the bow. But again, that belongs to the modern bow, where we have much more weight up here in comparison to the frog. It's not built on the principles of inequality that governed Baroque and to a significant degree classical bow making. So I think those are some things to keep in mind. And even when we're playing with a modern bow, I think it's a good idea to try to reproduce the kinds of bow strokes that would have been in Mozart's ear when he was composing these. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Okay, so what are some specific bowing considerations that we encounter then in Mozart's concertos? Okay, so I mentioned generally down bow on downbeats or on strong beats, except where the bowing more or less explicitly suggests otherwise, usually with an element of show or playfulness. In quick movements, generally non-legato between separate notes. Most often that applies to eighth notes, but sometimes you will even have figures like where we have half notes. I probably wouldn't go. Again, that's from the third concerto. That's not very idiomatic. We're going to have a little bit more separation, a little bit more of a sense of release. Also, we want to avoid doing that separation by détaché in the upper half. Usually, the kind of detachment that you will get in the stroke is by virtue of the natural release and natural lifting, natural springiness, slightly toward the lower half of the bow. Once we get into the upper half, we lose the natural spring, and so what we do is we'd have to keep the bow kind of in the string and do a détaché, which again belongs much more to Beethoven's time and later than to Mozart's. We'll also want to avoid legato between slurs, especially short slurs. In particular, two-note slurs should have a very prominent release to them. We'll want to lean on the first note and then release the second note. That sort of a stroke. So if we have a say 2/8 slurred followed by a quarter, instead of going, I'm going to lean on the first note and actually shorten the second note, perhaps as much as making it like a 16th note followed by a 16th rest. That's the formula that a lot of treatises prescribe. And again, that's an approximation, but that can be a good starting point to have in our minds, that we want to have that much release. I should quickly add here that I've sometimes found that when we talk about patterns of heavy and light or releases or such things, we often assume that everything has to be very kind of choppy. And of course that's not what we're saying at all, right? Always musical, always singing, but with singing that uses the inflection of words. That's the whole point. We don't want to just sing ah all the time. We want to sing with the kinds of inflections that would be appropriate to words. Or so that we're always feeling patterns of heavy and light that correspond to the naturalness of words. And when we speak a sentence, we use heavies and lights, right? Heavy and light syllables, but there are all sorts of different degrees to which we do that make speech interesting. So we want to do the same thing in music. Parenthetically, and this might be helpful to keep in mind, words were extremely important in connection with music in Mozart's time and before. In fact, even to the end of the Enlightenment, words were thought of as the kind of the crowning glory of human communication because they were rational, they were concrete, they were specific. So, for example, with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, you have this massive work that culminates in the spoken word, the sung word, right? You have instrumental music for the first three movements, but then the pinnacle of it all is when the voices come in, and the voices give rational, concrete expression to words, to concepts, to feeling. It all comes out rationally in words. Whereas not long after, by Mendelssohn's time, people were starting to say things like, music begins where words end. So now it's no longer words that are the crowning glory, it's music that starts where words leave off. But we're still talking about, of course, the Enlightenment time. So we need to think about words and rational verbal communication as being very important to how composers conceive music. All right, a few final considerations for now, by way of introduction. Trills we're going to do always from the top in Mozart. We often think that in the Baroque and classical period, trills were always from the top. That's not entirely true. In the French Baroque, yes, trills were from the top. The earlier Italian Baroque and some of the Germanic areas influenced by Italy actually would normally trill from the main note. Bach and Handel probably mostly from the top. Sometimes there's some question about when and where to do that. But in Mozart's concertos, we're going to trill from the top. The galant style that was so influential in the high classical idiom really favored those trills from above. So we're always going to trill from above. Vibrato, if we're going to take a historical approach, vibrato is going to be used quite sparingly. Leopold Mozart, Mozart's Wolfgang's father, describes vibrato as an ornament meant to imitate nature herself. And he likens it to when you strike a bell and you hear a clang, and then after the clang, there's this clang, there's this tremulant quality. In fact, he calls vibrato not vibrato but tremolo. We think of tremolo as changing the bow very, very rapidly, but he uses the vibrato. He calls vibrato tremolo, and I think the idea behind that is that it's this tremulant quality in the sound that's meant to warm the sound, so we can use it on a lyrical note to imitate the warmth of a vocal vibrato. We call that a messa di voce in a longer note. So you hold a note, and toward the middle, you just let the sound bloom with a little bit of tremulant quality in the note. And the other way to use it is on a longer and more emphatic note. We're probably not going to use it in the maybe more 19th century Franco-Belgian way of articulating the beginning of a note that then became the norm after the 19th century. Instead, we're going to let the note sound and then have a little bit of wiggle, a little bit of tremulant quality in the sound to warm it and to give a natural feeling of the sound decaying elegantly. So that's how Leopold Mozart would have envisioned tremolo or vibrato being used. Very different from a modern feature of tone production that's more or less constant and really quite a lot wider than what he would have had in view. And again, we are using different instruments and different strings than Mozart would have been using. So, we can adapt one way or another, and there's no absolute right way to do this. But that's just the consideration that we want to have in our minds as we want to know what's historical and what's not, and then we can make decisions from there. Another thing to keep in mind, whenever we see a slur in Baroque music, Bach and whatnot, generally we want to avoid shifting under slurs. In Mozart's time, I think we are newly permitted to enjoy shifting under slurs. We have fingerings in a few cases from Haydn and others that actually require that shifts be made. So we know that we can infer that players at the time were starting to use glissando, which is very much not what we would do if we were playing, say, a Bach sonata. But for Mozart, we can do that. And we're not talking about a Heifetz type, this sort of a glissando where it's slow toward the bottom, or faster toward the bottom, slower toward the top with an electric vibrato going into the note. That's not at all the aesthetic of Mozart's time. It would be more kind of heavy but slower and more mellow. But, we want to apply that elegantly, tastefully, but my point is that we don't need to shy away from that. We can be willing to shift under slurs and enjoy a little bit of that kind of cantabile glissando that results. One last and somewhat more substantial performance consideration. What do we do with grace notes? First of all, they are going to be always on the beat in Mozart's time. The primary difference that writers of the period make is between long and short grace notes. So generally, if the grace note is half the length of the note that follows, it's going to be long, which means that you will play it as at least half the value of the following note. And I believe it's CPE Bach says that if you have a note that's divisible into a group of three rather than two, like say a dotted quarter or a dotted half, that if you have a long appoggiatura beforehand, that it actually makes up 2/3 the length of the note. So we're talking about a very long, very expressive note, very often dissonant, and we can really kind of lean on those expressive long grace notes. The other type is a short grace note, which will show itself by being less than half the length of the note that follows. So, for example, if you have a notated quarter note and the grace note before it is a 16th, that's an indication that it's a short grace note and can just be played on the beat as a sometimes it's just a snap, sometimes it's just a short, expressive but not lingering grace note, but again, always on the beat. This gets a little bit sticky in the case of eighth notes preceded by a 16th grace in an allegro. Let me see if I can find a good example here. Mozart's Fifth Concerto. So the question is, what do we do with an eighth note preceded by a grace note of a 16th, right? A 16th grace note. And there can be a couple of different solutions. One, in a case like this, bum, 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 it's pretty clear that it's just intended to be a snap. It is half the length of the eighth note, but then again, in a fast tempo, composers don't usually write a grace shorter than a 16th. So if they want to snap, they would just write a 16th grace. Same thing goes for the very end of the movement, the end of the rondo theme. Right here. There we go. Those are just little kind of gentle snaps on the beat. The time where it's different, or the case in which something different should be read, is in a passage like this, where it's surrounded by other 16th notes. I believe it's Turk who says that in those cases, the 16th should actually be treated like a long appoggiatura, meaning half the length of the following eighth note. So we will play these as more or less even 16th notes. But even there, I think we can feel like the first note has the expressive capacity of an appoggiatura. So it's not just even 16ths. Here we go. But those first notes that are written as an appoggiatura have a certain weight because they're dissonant in this case, and that's often why composers will notate them that way. So we can kind of lean on that dissonance just a little bit more, feel the expressive quality, even while we're basically playing them like even 16ths. So this is important to know because if we're not using, first of all, it'll tell us how to interpret an Urtext edition, but if we're not using an Urtext edition, many of the editions that we find in the 20th century, like this one, for instance, will write out in specific note lengths what they think Mozart's appoggiaturas mean, and many times actually they get it quite wrong, unfortunately. And it's just, it's not meant to be overly critical. It's just that we have the greater benefit of hindsight and greater musicological research at this point than they did when these editions were being made, and they were grasping in the dark just a little bit more. So let's have a look at the beginning of this third Mozart concerto, and just have a look at how differently the solo line here begins. That right there, and the solo line over here begins about there, right? So right from the start, okay, we have some difference in slurring and the fourth beat of the first measure, but then immediately in the second measure, that short appoggiatura is rendered as a full eighth note over here. Whereas then back here, after the short appoggiatura, Mozart actually writes out the 2/8 the second time. So clearly he wants something different between this time and this time. We lose that distinction the first time. Then here, Mozart gives us a trill with 3 staccato eighths. Over here, it's written as a quintuplet turn from the main note. So what I would do for this trill here, usually in Mozart's time, trills will start from the upper neighbor. They always start from the upper neighbor, but very often we'll have a little Nachschlag at the end. So we'll start from above, and then have those two notes at the end. When he puts a dot over a note like that, it's a little awkward, and we probably don't have time to do that. So I usually just do a quick trill without the Nachschlag, and I start from above and basically just play 4 notes. An upper neighbor with a quick turn, a single turn. But the other edition represents it as with a quintuplet turn slurred into the next note. So again, my point is just very, very different. So if we're using an Urtext edition, we'll see something very different represented. And then if we know how to interpret that Urtext, especially in this case in terms of what are long appoggiatures and what are short appoggiatures, we'll be in a much better position to interpret what Mozart writes. So in general, in a nutshell, if the appoggiatura is half the length of the following note, it's a long appoggiatura and takes up half the length of the note that follows. If it's less than that if the appoggiatura is less than that duration, then it's a short appoggiatura and it's just a small passing note on the beat. Except in the case of an eighth note preceded by a 16th appoggiatura in the context of other 16th notes. Then we'll generally play it like moving 16th notes. Great, so I think I'll leave it there for now as our introduction. I'll pick up in another video and we'll dive right into some of the specifics about execution of Mozart's Third Violin Concerto. Thanks for watching.